The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This speech about the budget bills is inspired by the millions of people angry at a budget that threatens this country's way of life. Amongst them, there are many who always feared that this budget is exactly what Tony Abbott would do if he ever got his hands on the reins of power. But there are also many who never expected that an Australian government would charge sick people more to see a doctor while Gina Rinehart gets taxpayer-subsidised fuel. There are people who never imagined that the government would give away billions in tax breaks to the wealthy while forcing people under 30 to live without any income at all because the government has taken it away. And there are many who believed that although it was under pressure, they believed that the compact underlying our society that says that if you're young or you're old or you get sick or you fall on hard times, we would look after you, that compact would endure. And there are probably even those people who were just so sick of Labor infighting that they voted for Tony Abbott just for the sake of any alternative. But there are also, Deputy Speaker, those who believed Tony Abbott when he said that there would be no cuts to health, education or pensions. But wherever people come from, though, one thing is now crystal clear. Whoever people voted for last time, no one voted for this budget. Tony Abbott has sucker-punched the Australian people. He said whatever he had to get into office and then turn around and delivered for this country's 1%. He is doing the bidding of people who think it's okay to take away the income of a job seeker under 30 and force them onto the street, but who squeal like stuck pigs if you suggest taking away their $11 billion in fossil fuel subsidies and making them pay the same for petrol as everyone else in this country. Tony Abbott has delivered for the people who believe it's fine.
I ask the honourable member to refer to the member.
The Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, has delivered for the people who think it's fine to raise the GST or cut the pension, but who howl with outrage when the Greens suggest a tax on the big banks or the big polluters that would raise the billions we desperately need to fund the services expected in a decent society. We could balance the budget by asking the big miners, the big banks or the big polluters to pay a bit more, but instead the Prime Minister has savagely rounded on the rest of us. It takes guts to stand up to the wealthy and raise the revenue to fund a caring society, but a coward takes the axe to the young, the sick and the poor. This Prime Minister is a clear and present danger to the Australian way of life. We don't have a budget emergency, we have a government emergency. Now, I first got involved in politics, Mr Deputy Speaker, when I was at uni. My dad was the first person in his immediate family to go to university, and his dad before him spent his life working in the post office. And my dad went to uni because he could afford it, and my mum and my dad ensured that I got a good education. But it was when the then Labor government started hiking education fees that I got active in politics, because I could see it was going to get to a point where people like my dad would never be able to go to university again. And I now see thousands like me taking to the streets regularly to demand that everyone in this country has the right to go to university, no matter what your background. But they also know that education is vital for our democracy, because when everyone can learn, regardless of their wealth, our country is stronger for it. But when education is the privilege of a wealthy few, they will govern for those wealthy few. And now that they themselves have had the benefit of pre-education, the Prime Minister and his associates are pulling up the ladder behind them, turning around and saying a big stuff you to everyone else in the country. Mr Deputy Speaker, this budget will ruin Gen Y and all who come after them. People already face the triple burden of global warming, insecure work and unaffordable housing. But now the divide between the haves and the have-nots and the secure and the insecure is going to become permanent. TAFE or uni will leave you with a debt the size of a small mortgage. And youth unemployment in Melbourne at the moment is 14%, and in Ballarat it's 26%. And if you're lucky enough to find a job after having been forced to endure poverty, imagine what kind of workplace and appalling wages and conditions people will be expected to put up with, knowing that if they speak up and get sacked or they leave, They'll go months with no income at all. This is not the kind of country we want. The Prime Minister has no mandate to create an underclass in this country, and we must now force him to submit his poisonous recipe for a divided country to the judgment of the Australian people. And when it comes to attacking young people, lifting university fees, or dismantling Medicare, the Greens commit to blocking these budget bills. The Greens relish the chance to remove the Prime Minister before the end of this year. But we can't do that by ourselves. We need an alliance for a new election. These bastards can't be kept honest, but they can be kicked out. If the Greens, Labor and the Palmer Party accept our significant differences but agree to work together, we can block this budget and have Tony Abbott out of office by Christmas. If the other parties are up for it, we can try to make it happen. Now, I want Clive Palmer's coal business to stop and for fossil fuels to stay in the ground. I want Labor to stop punishing refugees and adopting Tony Abbott's or the Prime Minister's appalling climate pollution targets. These differences will persist, and I will not give up until this country is grounded on sustainability, compassion and equality. But what I also know is that Australia only has a chance to become a country we can be proud of if we kick the current Prime Minister out first. We need an alliance for a new election. We must all agree to block this budget and try and force the Prime Minister to a new election this year. Because if this budget is passed, Australia may be irreparably damaged, and the people know it. And right around this land, we are witnessing the people of Australia starting to reclaim their country. We hear talk from the government that we have to take these measures because there's an emergency, because we no longer have the revenue we need to fund the services Australians expect. Well, one answer to that, Mr Deputy Speaker, could be to increase our revenue. One place we could start is by keeping the price on carbon, or the carbon tax. It brought in $6.6 billion, which this government now wants to take away. And that's $6.6 billion that currently is being paid by the big polluters, but will now have to be paid by people every time they go and see a doctor, if this government gets its way. We could keep the mining tax. We could get rid of the $11 billion in subsidies going to the likes of Gina Rinehart, and instead keep education affordable for everyone in this country. And as we've seen today, if this budget is allowed to pass and the Prime Minister is allowed to prevail, we will be going back to the dark ages. We have already seen CSIRO face massive cuts, plan to shed over 700 jobs, and start closing down entire sections of research. Areas like astronomy and astrophysics now face an uncertain future. And one crucial area that could have provided energy security and job security for people in the Latrobe Valley, geothermal energy, is now being axed completely. But never mind, there's always enough money left for coal seam gas and for unconventional fuels. But when it comes to something that is a potential renewable power source for this country, where the hot energy under the earth powers our lights and warms our buildings, no, we can't find money for that. We will take the axe to CSIRO. And we've potentially foregone the next Wi-Fi or the next flu vaccine because of this government's short-sightedness. It turns out Knights and Dames wasn't just a distraction, it was actually a real vision of the medieval anti-science society this Prime Minister has in mind for the country. We are about to have a situation where someone who has very little money will think twice about getting that lump on their leg checked out because they might not be able to afford to go and see the doctor, where people will think twice about taking their family or their kids to the doctor because they know that each time you go, you're going to have to pay a fee, and if the doctor sends you off for a test, you're going to have to pay a fee on that, and if there's a prescription, you have to pay a fee on that as well. Multiply that by your family members and it starts to add up. Why is it the case that it's okay to have a debate and say maybe we need to raise the GST, or maybe we need to raise doctors' fees that the bulk of the population will pay, but we can't have a debate about asking the big banks the big miners or the big polluters to pay just a little bit more. Because I reckon if we had to take this budget to an election and ask the Australian people, what do you think is a fairer way to balance the budget? Asking Gina Rinehart and the big banks to chip in, or taking the axe to the young, the sick and the poor, I know what people would say. And we are seeing the government's short-sighted agenda writ large when it comes to the question of funding roads. Now, in this context, there's been debate about a proposed increase in the petrol excise. Now, let me say this, Mr Deputy Speaker. If it helps cut pollution, then lifting the relative cost of fossil fuels can make sense. If it helps the shift to cheaper, quicker and cleaner transport, like trains, trams and buses, then indexing petrol excise can make sense. However, making petrol cost more just so the government can build more roads makes absolutely no sense at all. The Liberals should not assume we will help their road-obsessed agenda. This Liberal government is giving $3 billion to a polluting east-west tollway that will wreck inner-city Melbourne and has no business case, but then cuts federal funding to public transport. Building more roads to cure congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. It won't work. Lifting the excise on petrol to fund public transport is one thing, but using it to build more polluting roads makes no sense. We will be looking very closely at the government's petrol tax legislation. But around the country, Deputy Speaker, one thing that can't be denied is that in response to a government that is attacking the young, the sick and the poor, people are rising up to say, not on my watch. Angry at a budget that continues the handouts for the big miners, big banks and big polluters, people are defending the commonwealth of Australia. The millions in this country want a society based on compassion, sustainability and equality. We want Australia to be a place where everyone can get to a doctor or a hospital when they need it. And if you do find yourself sick, the first thing that the paramedics and the doctors check isn't your credit card, it's your Medicare card. We want Australia to be a place where people can live with dignity after they've contributed, not be forced to work until they drop and then eke out a grim existence in poverty. And we want an Australia running on renewable energy, not polluting fossil fuels. We want Australia to be a place where people under 30 aren't kicked out onto the street by their landlord because the government has taken away their income. We want an Australia where people who are already under pressure because of unaffordable housing and insecure work aren't left on their own, because we know if we leave people on their own and throw them to the wolves, life will just get harder. And to everyone who stands with us, I say that you are the defenders of the true heart of this country. Not this government, but you, the people. You are the defenders of the spirit of care, of looking after each other and looking after Australia that binds us together. You are the real protectors of what is good about Australia. And what people are doing in the streets and around the kitchen table and in their homes right here and right now is vital and could change the course of history. And the Greens stand right beside you, and we will be your voice in Parliament. And if we work together and defend not the privileged few, but the commonwealth of Australia, we can bust this budget. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll conclude by reminding people that last year, the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, came to Melbourne and he said, these Greens are having too much influence in Parliament. Having too much influence in Parliament, and so I'm going to make a captain's call and say I'd much rather there be Labor people in Parliament, and I'm going to direct you to put the Greens last. And he said that because he knew that on the things that mattered, when it comes to standing up for a caring society and raising the revenue Australians need to fund the services they expect, he knew that the Greens would fight him tooth and nail. And so it will be with this budget. We will be the real opposition to this government's cruel and heartless agenda that will make Australia a meaner place. And I say to the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, if you want to come and make a captain's call and say, put the Greens last, well, game on, Captain, game on. We are up for this, and we would relish nothing more than to force you to take your poisonous recipe for a divided society to the judgment of the Australian people, and we can't wait until there is a change of Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Melbourne.